right, everyone, thank you for joining us. Dissertation committee, thank you for all of your help putting this all together. I certainly would not be even close to where I am today if I didn't have all of your advice along the way. So, without further ado, I'm just going to get into it here and present to you the Public Accounting Premium and Investigation of Aggregated Earnings for Accounting Professionals. My plan is I'm going to start by giving you some background and some motivation of why I actually care about this topic and why it's relevant in the field. From there, I'll build up to my main research question. Before then, I get into the contributions, a really brief overview of the literature review to help me build my hypotheses. And then I'll share my research design, the results of the research, actually running my regression models, and then some robustness tests before I finish with key conclusions and limitations. So with that, let's get into it. All right, so this started out based on my own profession, right, as Abby talked about. I was once an accounting student. I worked in public accounting and audit. I'm a CPA. And now as a faculty member, I handle this with students almost every single day where they ask, should I start my career in public accounting or should I start my career in industry? So accounting has so many different options of what you can do, but those are kind of your two first big broad categories of choices that you make. And it's always been passed down, call it folk wisdom, that you start in public accounting and you're going to put in a lot of time, a lot of work. And then eventually, if you decide to leave public accounting, you get a big premium, right? You get paid, you get a raise for your experience. So that's like the foundation of why I started caring about this question. Then when I started the DBA program itself, I started to see some articles in the news in the Wall Street Journal talking about this shortage of accounting professionals. Now, not only was it a shortage, but it was also reflecting on how this is a really tough career choice, long hours, relatively low pay for what you're putting in, and there's not a lot of people that are getting into it right now. So I've always had this interest anyway, and now it's popping up in the media, so I'm thinking, hey, maybe there's an opportunity here. I kept going with my research just a little bit deeper, and I found the AICPA with their trends report. They were showing that the number of accounting graduates had actually been declining steadily since around a peak of 2015. And it was fairly steadily, but especially in the last couple of years, post-COVID, it was closer to about 25% per year. So before that, you're looking at 17 or 18% per year. That's a really big jump in an industry that already has high turnover. Then on the other hand, I started looking at industry reports. So accounting firms, they publish audit quality reports. And in those reports, they state every year their voluntary turnover at different levels. And so what they found is that the turnover was, again, closer to 25% instead of the 17 or 18. So combined, this is known as the pipeline problem. There's fewer people that are entering the public accounting profession because they're not graduating from accounting programs. And then also when they are in public accounting, they're leaving earlier with that turnover being higher. This is such a big deal that the National Pipeline Advisory Group was convened by the AICPA to help solve it and protect the accounting profession as a whole. Now, in their report, they had 6 total findings. One of them was all about enhancing the employee experience, and that ties in specifically to what I want to look at, which is increasing pay transparency at higher levels. Now, I started getting a little bit deeper into research then and said, well, what has academia done to look at pay levels for accounting? And what I found is a lot of research has been done on perceptions. And so you survey students and say, where do you think you should go to increase your earnings, right? What is the best option for you? But it's all based on perceptions. And then there's another branch of research that looks at what are starting salaries. So it could be students that have accepted offers or early career professionals. And then a little bit of research that looks at what are current levels of salary. So if you've been in the accounting profession for a few years, what are the current levels of salaries? So there is existing research in this area, but what I'm really interested in is aggregated earnings. So salary over the entire course of the career, not just starting out, not just at any one particular time, but does that public accounting experience translate into higher salary over time, that you lose out on maybe some initial years of salary, but by the end, it more than makes up for that difference. Now, the last paper on this part to kind of bring us to a research question came from Trnka et al. In 2022. It was published in Accounting Horizons, which is an A-level accounting journal, and they looked at what is the career earnings for public accountants. And now they had a number of weaknesses I'm going to identify in advance with my research, but it kind of laid the groundwork for me that there are other researchers that are not just looking at current salaries, but are looking at earnings over the course of an entire career. So with all that background, my own motivations, plus what we see happening in industry, I came up with the following research question. How does public accounting experience impact aggregated earnings for accounting graduates relative to non-public accounting experience? I will break this apart into 5 smaller, more manageable questions for you, but this is kind of the big overarching question that I want to answer. First, I want to focus on my accounting graduates. So accounting graduates, I am one, right? I work with them, not every day after they graduate, but I work with students who are going to be accounting graduates. That's what I know, that's my area of expertise. Second, I care about public accounting experience because it is such an impactful decision that these students have to make to start in public accounting versus non-public accounting or industry, as we would say. And then lastly, I'm concerned about aggregated earnings because I want to know, is it worth it, right? The sacrifice that you put into public accounting in those early years, does it pay off in the long term? So with that, who cares, right? How is this going to help with anything? Well, it helps both academia and practitioners. On an academic side of things, I identified a secondary data set. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of the existing research in this area is based on surveys. And I found a secondary data set that allowed me to quantify things in a different way that's not based on memory or just the respondents, and also more, right? It expands the respondents and expands the generalizability, where prior researchers have identified perceptions of students. I can actually test those perceptions to see are they in fact true or not. Third, Trnka et al., like I mentioned, kind of, I don't know if they broke down this one or advanced the research to look at aggregated or career earnings. I'm advancing their study by addressing some of their stated weaknesses. For as an example, their study ended data collection in 2014. They recommended extending it, and I extended it all the way through 2024. All of their survey respondents came from one school. They don't say which one, but one school. And my longitudinal database comes from anyone who graduated from any university in Minnesota. So I expand on some of their stated weaknesses, and I actually answer their request to better understand this public accounting premium by adding more nuance to it. Now, that's on the academic side, so I have an opportunity to advance the literature. From a practitioner perspective, I can also help, so bridge the gap, right, through this DBA program that we're in. One, I can help college faculty and advisors. Anyone who's really going to help students or provide advice to students, having this information will help them give better, more informed advice. Second, CPA firms are always looking to recruit individuals and then retain those individuals once they are recruited. And so having my findings where I will see that those with public accounting experience have higher aggregated earnings, that helps them with their recruiting and messaging that they have. And then lastly, this research directly responds to the call from the National Pipeline Advisory Group, which is a practitioner organization. So the research does help both academia and practitioners. Now, my specific research questions. First, how does public accounting experience impact aggregated earnings relative to non-public accounting experience? The literature in this area, like I mentioned earlier, is based largely on student beliefs that by going into public accounting is going to lead to long-term, so career growth and financial success. Most of these articles, Bagley, Bring, Dowse, etc., those are all based, again, off of surveys. And so I'm expanding on what they're doing by using a secondary database instead of just a survey response. Trnka, like I've mentioned a couple of times already, they found public accounting experience leads to higher career earnings. And I want to see if that's true for more than just the grads that they found, right, that they had. And then third, Levinson, he used data from PwC, and KPMG published their own report in 2022 showing that the longer their employees stayed in public accounting, that led to a higher salary. So that was just a 1 point salary, but also KPMG published a survey based on their own data. They're not necessarily an independent source. I'm not saying that they're wrong, but I want to expand on that as someone who's a little bit more independent. So that existing literature leads me to hypothesize that there's a positive relationship between accounting graduates' public accounting experience and aggregated earnings. Now, my second research question, same general idea, but it's more of a branch off, where instead of looking at all accounting graduates over my sample period, I am just looking at those graduates that have experience in public accounting themselves. And to put this in more plain English terms, I want to know, does it matter if a graduate starts in a Big 4 public accounting firm versus a non-Big Four public accounting firm. So are all public accounting experiences created equal? Are some firms going to position those students for more success than other firms? Now, existing literature in this area, students again have that perception that Big Four is the best place to start. In the Big Four firm, you have the biggest clients, the greatest complexities, and that leads then to more career opportunities because you learn that, right, when you're a student working there. Trnka studied this for larger size firms. It wasn't Big Four completely, but it's larger size firms. And they found that these individuals had higher career earnings, but they also requested more research into this area and more nuance, which is what I'm hoping to provide. So based on the existing literature, I hypothesize that graduates with Big Four public accounting experience will have higher aggregated earnings than those with non-Big Four public accounting experience. So my third, fourth, and fifth questions all relate to moderators on the relationship between public accounting and aggregated earnings. And so this third one looks at the current firm size. It's different from my second research question where it's just a categorical within public accounting, Big Four and not Big Four. This one, looking at current firm size, considers all firms, not just the public accounting experience, but all firms in general. And when we take that, like back up for that approach, Big Four firms are no longer the biggest firms in the population. So if you think about my databases from Minnesota, you have like United Healthcare or Mayo Clinic or Target or Best Buy. There's a lot of very large players that makes public accounting a little bit small relative to that. So there's not a ton of accounting research in this. Trnka down here found that starting salaries were positively correlated with experience at large accounting firms. Well, that's just current and starting. I'm looking at the aggregated earnings and see if that has an impact. And then Zimmerman, Berlinieri, Oriopoulos, they found that larger firm size led to premium fees. So those firms can charge higher fees, and a higher fee that results in higher compensation for the employees. So based on those direct effects, I hypothesize that there's going to be a strengthening of the positive relationship between public accounting experience and aggregated earnings when the experience occurs at a larger firm. My fourth one examines the urban moderator. And so this one, instead of just size, gets at location, so geographic considerations. And when I'm thinking about these geographic considerations in urban areas, they may provide greater complexity of the firms, greater networking opportunities, and then greater job mobility because they are all concentrated in that urban area. And so I'm wondering, is that going to have an impact on the relationship of public accounting experience to aggregated earnings? There isn't much in accounting literature around this, so I had to borrow from economics research. And in that economics research, I found that workers in cities earn more and that the spatial density, so having all those urban areas like together, that creates productivity advantages, which I'm hypothesizing then is going to lead to a strengthening of the relationship between public accounting experience and aggregated earnings. My fifth research question gets into gender. And the idea, does gender have an impact on the relationship between aggregated or public accounting experience and aggregated earnings? And the existing research is actually a little bit mixed. So the first two bullet points here are more about positive, so gender socialization theory and voluntary turnover rates in accounting. And so when I say positive, in my data set, I coded men as 1 and women as 0. So these first two would make me think that existing literature would say men are going to have a stronger relationship or stronger benefit from their public accounting experience than women are. But then the bottom two, Dong found that the salary gap actually narrowed between men and women through 2015. And so for a decade past that, has that gap been eliminated? And then Owasu and Hardy's, they were studying partners. It was in European countries, not in the United States. But they found female audit partners were able to have more on-time audits and charge higher fees, which would make me think that women actually had higher salaries. So because the research is a little bit split, I actually hypothesize that there is no difference in the strength of relationship based on gender in public accounting experience and aggregated earnings. So that's a really quick review, right, of my proposal here, but let me actually share how I went up and actually tested some of these hypotheses. So for my research design, I found a data source in Minnesota called the SLEDS database, the State Longitudinal Educational Database System. And the way this works is that Minnesota's Department of Education they capture educational data for anyone who graduates. It actually goes back to elementary school, but think through any university, and as well as demographic data. And then also any employer in Minnesota is required to pay state unemployment tax. And as part of submitting their records for state unemployment tax, they say, here are all the employees that I have, here are the earnings that they made in that quarter. And then I also have employer information, so like location, size, some other variables that I use in my research. So what the SLEDS team does, I put in a request, and they combine all this information, and I'm able to track individuals from the time they graduate with an accounting degree until the time they leave the workforce in Minnesota. So that's how the longitudinal database is created. Now, ultimately, my sample was any individual who graduated in Minnesota with at least an undergraduate accounting degree from 2006 through the first quarter of 2024. So 2006 was the first point, because that was the first time they started tracking all the data that I needed. And then they actually pulled the data on my behalf for Q1 2024. So that's why the sample period ends there. For each record then in my sample, it's for an individual for that quarter. Where were they working? How much money they made? And I'm able to pair that then with all the other information about their employers and their background information. This resulted in actually a pretty big sample size. So initially, I had over 25,000 individuals and just under 900,000 different quarterly observations to look at. I needed to do some cleaning or sanitization. So for example, there are a lot of gaps in the data set. This could be when someone graduated from the University of Minnesota, when worked outside Minnesota for a number of years, and then they came back into Minnesota. So that would impact their earnings, but I don't have earnings records for the time they were gone. So after I cleaned the data set and removed some of the records with gaps, I ended up with 14,000 individuals and just under 500,000 observations. So still a pretty robust data set to answer my questions. For the second hypothesis, where I'm just looking at individuals with public accounting experience, I have 6,300 individuals and just over 200,000 observations. So there's a lot of data to analyze to how to answer these questions. Now, let me give you a little overview of the data. As you can see, the number of records increases consistently over time. That first in 2024, it looks a lot smaller because I just have first quarter data. But not only the number of records, but also the number of unique individuals included in the data set increases over time. Number two, if you look at the graduates per year, you can see in Minnesota that the number of graduates increases steadily, mirroring the AICPA trends until 2015. And then it decreases fairly steeply and really cuts off after COVID timeframes. Now, 2023 is a little bit shorter than you would expect, because I asked the people at SLEDS about this. Some universities report graduation data a little later in the year in 2024, and so it only captures partial information. But you get a sense for the general trend of what's going on with the data. Now, if we look at the descriptive statistics here, I want to use this to also share what my actual variables are. My main dependent variable is aggregated earnings. And so to create aggregated earnings, I took each individual's quarterly wage record and I adjusted it back to 2006 levels. And I used two different CPI deflators to do this. So that way I'm comparing apples to apples, right? And stripping off the impacts of inflation. Then I created a running total. So the first quarter would have the first wage amount, and then the second quarter would be the second quarter wage plus the prior, and then create a running total that way. And then lastly, I divided this amount by 1,000, so that way it's a little bit easier for interpretation and just put everything in thousands. You can see this variable has quite a bit of variation like you would expect. The mean value is just over 271,000 with a standard deviation of 264,000. And so as you have people who just start in the data set in just one quarter versus someone who's been in the data set for almost 20 years, you would expect there to be a lot of variation. I should mention too, all these variables are any applicable variables I winsorized to remove or help reduce the impact of outliers. And then further, I created the log adjusted aggregated earnings as an alternative dependent variable to reduce the variation in that, to make sure my results aren't just a results of variation in the data or outliers in the data. My main independent variable of interest is public experience. And so to create this one, it's a running total of an individual's quarters worked in public accounting. So the first quarter of public accounting would be 1, the second quarter would be 2. It's a running total number. You can see in the data, the mean is 5 quarters of public accounting experience for the mean in the whole one, but there's a large standard deviation of 9 quarters because there's a bunch of individuals in the data set, more than half, that don't have any public accounting experience. The next two variables, public accounting experience ever, public experience 1 year, those are alternative independent variables that I created to further test my main results for robustness. In case there's measurement error in my public experience, then I can use these other ways to see if my results hold with different ones. The next 4 are all ways of measuring Big Four. So there's a lot on there, but the reason why I needed 4 different variables for this was because everything in the data set is anonymous. So I don't know names of individuals, I don't know names of companies. If I'm trying to identify the Big Four, I need to create proxy variables for that. So I really found 2 different ways to create proxy variables. One was based on the total number of employees for a given firm, and the second one was based on the total wages paid for another firm. And those 2 mostly lined up, but I wanted to run it both ways to make sure I'm reducing measurement error as much as possible. Now, the first 2 here, those are the ones I use in my analysis. That's a running total of the number of quarters worked for a Big Four firm. And then the second 2 are dummy variables, if an individual ever worked for a Big Four firm or not. You can see across the entire data set, it's only 15 or 16% of the observations relate to individuals with Big Four experience. So it's a fairly small group relative to the entire data set. The remaining variables on here I use as moderating variables or as dummy variables. So firm size is the moderator in one analysis, otherwise it's going to be a control variable for me. It is the log adjusted number of employees in a firm to again reduce the variability with it. Urban dummy, if we look at that one, we can see that 72% of my observations relate to work experience in urban areas. And then gender, 49% of the observations relate to males, which means 51% would relate to females for that one. All right, so my next ran correlation table is to just get an initial idea of what are we seeing for relations. So with these correlation tables, this is just univariate, right? How one variable interacts with the other variable, doesn't take into everything else, but it still provides some initial direction for my findings. Initially, public experience, however I measure it, plus all the Big Four experience, all have a positive and significant relationship with aggregated earnings, which provides, again, initial support that I will test in more depth in a little bit later. For firm size, urban dummy, and gender, because I'm looking at these mainly as moderators, I wasn't as concerned with the direct correlation to aggregated earnings. Okay, so let's get into the actual models that I ran to test my hypotheses. This model takes all my variables that I have. My main variable of interest is public experience, public accounting experience, and I want to see how it impacts aggregated earnings. Within these models, I also considered industry fixed effects to cover any impacts of certain industries that might impact aggregated earnings that are not already observed in the data. I also used year fixed effects to help with some macro conditions that happen every single year that, again, are not captured in the data anyway. You'll see on the next slide, I also use grad year fixed effects. So year fixed effects help me to capture what's happening in any sort of given year, and I can compare results across different cohorts. If I do grad year fixed effects, then that's going to compare what happened, what are the macro conditions in place at the time that that cohort graduated, and how that has an impact. And so I want to look at both of these, but I'm not able to look at both of them together because they are very much related to each other. So to give you the answer for this one, this hypothesis is supported, right? Public accounting experience has a positive and significant impact on aggregated earnings. Now, if we look at it, first I want to give you just a little visual. And so these are using adjusted figures, but you can see the orange line here on top, that is for any individual with at least 1 year of public accounting experience. The blue line is anyone without any public accounting experience. And then down on the bottom, these are the number of quarters that I had. I just arbitrarily cut it off after 40 quarters because that was 10 years worth of experience. And I think we can see the trend that's happening here. So what you see here is that initially, or just look at a current salary level, it looks like public accounting and industry basically have the same salaries. There's no difference, or if anything, industry is just a little bit higher. Around the 1 year mark, it's still about the same. You start to see a small difference around year 2. And then as you go on, by year 10, it results in almost a $100,000 difference in aggregated earnings for individuals with at least 1 year of public accounting experience versus someone without any public accounting experience. If we look at the results of the regression table, you can see the public experience here is positive and significant. It's the first variable that I show in all cases that I looked at. So in the first two columns, I use aggregated earnings as my dependent variable. And then in my second two columns, I use the log adjusted aggregated earnings, again, to further reduce the variation that I'm seeing. In column 1 and column 3, those are the results where I have year fixed effects. And then in columns 2 and columns 4 is when I use grad year fixed effects. So in all cases, aggregated earnings, log adjusted aggregated earnings, year fixed effects, grad year fixed effects, with all of my control variables, the public accounting experience has a positive and significant relationship with aggregated earnings. Now, one comment or concern that I had doing this was, what if there are individual factors that aren't captured by the data set that are actually driving my results? So to account for this, I ran another model using person ID fixed effects, so individual fixed effects. This would cover, say, one person just has a higher natural ability, or one person has more motivation, or one person has a different background. I don't have that data. And so by using individual fixed effects, I'm able to account for that. You see my findings are still positive and significant with both aggregated earnings and log adjusted aggregated earnings. And so it doesn't appear that there are any individual issues that I don't capture in the data set that are just driving my results. I do want to note on this slide that a lot of my control variables disappeared when I use individual fixed effects. That's because if a variable doesn't change for an individual over time, say example, their gender, right? Their gender doesn't change over time, then the individual fixed effects is going to capture that already, so it's not separately shown. All right, now one more concern is that my results are just driven based on time. And so the idea is that over time, you would expect an individual's aggregated earnings to grow. And also over time, you would expect public accounting experience would also grow, right? So what I'm seeing with my results isn't actually public accounting experience impacting aggregated earnings. It's just a natural impact of time that's driving that relationship. So to address this concern, I use a technique called time detrending. And so with this technique, for any variable of interest, it is regressed against time. And so for me, I did public experience, aggregated earnings, and log adjusted aggregated earnings. And so when it's regressed against time, I have that regression model, but any extra factor, any error factor on the regression then is going to be used to create a time detrended variable. So basically I'm able to pull out the impact of time, and then I use the time detrended variable to run my regression. So in these ones, you'll see public experience underscore T, aggregated earnings underscore T, and the log of aggregated earnings underscore T. That is after I have pulled out the impacts of time. So it's the residuals from that regression. And you can see it's still positive and significant, which makes me believe that it's not just the time effect that's driving the aggregated earnings. All right, let's move on to research question number 2, looking at, is all public accounting experience created equally? So this one is in fact supported, that Big Four experience leads to higher aggregated earnings, that's correlated with higher aggregated earnings than non-Big Four experience. I looked at this one 8 different ways. So there's a lot going on in this table, but don't worry, I will explain it to you. I used 4 different independent variables to study the impact on aggregated earnings. The first 2 variables are running total number of quarters worked for a Big Four firm. In columns 1 and 2, I looked at Big Four firms quantified by the number of employees. In columns 3 and 4, I looked at the Big Four firms quantified by the total wages paid by the firm. And then in columns 5 and 6, 7 and 8, I just use a dummy variable. So has Big Four experience or does not have Big Four experience. And in all cases, my results were positive and significant on whether I use year fixed effects or grad year fixed effects, thus supporting my hypothesis. All right, for my third research question and 4th and 5th, I looked at a moderating relationship. And what I find for this one is that the positive relationship between public accounting and aggregated earnings is actually strengthened when the experience occurs at larger size firms. And so to really leverage public accounting experience, students, when they decide to leave public accounting, should try to go to bigger firms if the motivation is to maximize their aggregated earnings. For this model, I ran regular public experience against aggregated earnings as positive and significant, like we've seen in all other cases. I ran firm size against aggregated earnings, also positive and significant as a direct effect. But then the real key is this interaction effect. Public experience times firm size. That's a new variable I created to measure the interaction effect. As you can see, it is positive and significant. 3 stars, that's a 0.01 level. So very significant. For my fourth question, I studied the impacts of an urban location on the relationship between public experience and aggregated earnings. And I find that this hypothesis is supported. So when the experience occurs in an urban area or urban location, there's a stronger relationship between public experience and aggregated earnings. Now, the takeaway for students, what they should actually care about here is if they're trying to maximize their earnings, when they leave public accounting, they should go to an urban area instead of a rural area. Again, similar model to what I did with firm size. Public experience is positive and significant. The direct effect of urban on aggregated earnings is positive and significant. And we see a strong interaction effect as well, positive and significant. 3 stars means at the 0.01 level. All right, my fifth one, looking at gender, where I hypothesized that gender did not have an impact on the strength of the relationship, was actually rejected. I was wrong about this, but these findings actually lead me to think of some further research that doesn't actually fit within the dissertation, but I want to think about in the future. So public experience, again, positive and significant with aggregated earnings. The impact of gender here is very interesting. So in my first column, you can see it is a negative coefficient. And so a negative coefficient means that the direct effect of gender on aggregated earnings, women have higher aggregated earnings than men. That's how you'd interpret the negative there. But if we look at it with grad year fixed effects instead of year fixed effects within a cohort, then the significance disappears. So there is no difference then, right, within one specific cohort. If we look at the interaction effect, we go from a negative or non-significant result to the interaction is positive and significant at less than the 0.01 level, which makes me think there's something going on. So positive and significant would mean that men have a stronger relationship, public experience to aggregated earnings than women do. It's strengthened for men more so than it is for women. So interesting result. I don't want to get into the why about it here. That's not the focus of this dissertation. This focuses on what is happening, and future research can examine why that is the case. All right, so if we look at this, overall, I have positive and significant results pretty much every way that I show this public accounting experience leading to aggregated earnings. But there still might be issues in the way that I'm measuring things, so we designed a series of robustness tests and additional analyses to address potential issues. I'm going to start by talking about alternative measures of public accounting experience, so different variables related to, or different ways of measuring my independent variable. One, just using a dummy variable, public accounting experience ever, instead of a running total for quarters. This would help if I had any sort of measurement error or measurement bias when I designed the running total of public accounting quarters. As you can see, it's still positive and significant in all cases. Number two, I picked a threshold of at least 1 year of experience to count as public accounting experience. The reason I chose that number was because in 1 year, you go through an entire cycle in public accounting, all the way from planning through busy season. And so I was just anticipating that the employers would place more of a benefit on that. And you can see if I use the threshold of at least 1 year of experience, again, my results are positive and significant. So in all 3 ways that I construct my independent variable, in total of quarters, a dummy variable forever, and a dummy variable with at least 1 year of experience, is positive and significant. It's also possible that I could have created a measurement error in my dependent variable by using 2 different methods to calculate the CPI deflator. And so I used one for an urban area, one for a non-urban area, like I mentioned before. And so for this measure of this robustness test, I calculated the dependent variable just using one CPI deflator. I used the urban one because 72% of the observations related to urban areas. So using a constant CPI deflator, I still have positive and significant results, which tells me that my initial findings are not driven my measurement error, my dependent variable. Third, maybe I made a mistake in creating my accounting population. So when I requested accounting graduates, anyone with an undergraduate degree, I used six different CIP codes consistent with what the AICPA does. Some of those CIP codes are accounting plus something else, with maybe like a finance edge or a technology edge. And so there's a possibility that that extra little bit in the CIP code is what's actually driving aggregated earnings, and it's not just the accounting experience itself. So for this one, I just used the restrictive population that only had the most restrictive accounting major definition of the CIP code. And again, my results are still positive and significant for public accounting experience. All right, two more additional analyses that I did. This next one is called entropy balancing. And so with entropy balancing, the risk that I run is that my population might be skewed. And because the population is skewed and I'm trying to create a fit with a linear regression, that regression might be off as well. So to adjust for this using entropy balancing, I have a treatment group that's anyone with public accounting experience and a control group that's anyone without any sort of public accounting experience. As you can see, all these control variables have different means, variances, and skewness. So then with entropy balancing, it adjusts the weight of each observation. So it's not changing the underlying data, but certain observations in the control group are weighted more or less until the mean, variance, and skewness of the control group mimics that of the treatment group. So with this entropy balance population then, with the different weightings, I run my initial regression back to my original regression that I had before using the additional weightings. And again, my results are positive and significant. So it doesn't appear that just different characteristics of the control group versus the treatment group are driving my results. And so my last robustness test was the Lubell two-stage least squares test. And I want to think of this in two different ways. So first, I'm looking for reverse causality, right? And to adjust for reverse causality or check for that, that's where the secondary least squares method comes into play. And then also, I want to check to see if there's any sort of instrumented variable, so omitted variable bias that might be driving my results. And a way to do that is to create an instrumented variable or find an instrumented variable and run a regression against my instrumented variable. Lubell figured out a way to do this with the existing data that I have, because I searched for one, couldn't find one, but Lubell developed a method that's been used in accounting literature to develop an instrumental variable and then use it against public experience. And so I ran this regression using the instrumented public experience. And again, my results are still consistent. So what I'm seeing here is that my results are not driven by omitted variable bias or reverse causality based on the results of this test. So in conclusion, there is a positive relationship between public accounting experience and aggregated earnings. Big Four public accounting experience counts more. We want to say it in plain English. Those with Big Four public accounting experience have higher aggregated earnings than those with non-Big Four public accounting experience. And third, we have a positive relationship that is strengthened when individuals are employed by larger firms, when they're working in urban areas, and for males more so than for females. Who cares? Application-wise, practitioners, students find this information interesting when they're deciding what to do for their career and whether or not they should go into public accounting. Faculty who are trying to help the students and provide advice not based on the gut feeling like I have done, but actually want numbers to back up their advice are benefited from this research. And lastly, I've actually shared some preliminary results of public accounting firms, and they do find this research very interesting for their own purposes. In academia, I've extended and enhanced existing studies by using a secondary data set. So instead of relying on surveys or salaries at any one point in time measuring aggregated earnings, I've expanded the literature. And in particular, I've expanded on Trnka et al.'s request to add additional schools, have a longer time frame, and to reduce reliance or eliminate reliance, in my case, on survey respondents using actual data that's been provided to the state. There's a number of limitations to my research. My data comes exclusively from Minnesota. And so if I had data from Texas or one of the coast, maybe it would change my results a little bit. There is a self-selection bias. So anyone that I study made a choice to keep working in Minnesota. And if I were able to capture those individuals who left Minnesota or came back, I might have better results. I was only able to proxy the big four firms, not specifically identify those firms. And lastly, I would love to have more variables on individuals. So research has shown marital status, whether or not an individual has a CPA exam, have kids, that impacts their career decisions, but that's not captured by the data set. So I like to expand it that way. I have identified some opportunities for future research. I mentioned earlier, focusing on gender. I think it'd be really interesting to expand in that area. I also want to look at more specifically retention. So instead of using a dependent variable that is aggregated earnings, what factors, or can I identify factors that drive retention in firms? Second, I want to look at other ways of operationalizing earnings and experience to further mitigate potential time series. So I did time detrending, but there might be other ways to do that to make my results more reliable. And then lastly, I want to look at a little bit more specifically, when should an individual leave a public accounting firm if they want to maximize their earnings? Should it be at the senior level, the manager levels, or a magic number of years that sets them on the best trajectory? So with that, I'll turn it over for questions and comments.
So Ben, first of all, great job, very proud of you. Amazing presentation.
Thank you.
So I have two questions for you. So I know like you addressed the concern of linearity or time trend on your main DV, right? But what made you choose aggregated salary, not the salary at the particular point of time, like the quarterly salary or just annual salary?
Sure. So a few different, I guess, components to that answer to the question. Number one is I'm more curious about aggregated earnings, looking at salary over time. Number two, some of the research, I didn't share it here, but for example, the Center for Audit Quality, they did a survey of why did students choose accounting, and what they found is that students placed career earnings higher than salary, current salary. So those were both factors in their survey, and career earnings was in the top tier, and salary was the second one. So that shows me that students are more concerned with earnings over the course of their career. And then number three, back to my experience, I was always told that starting in public, you're not going to have super high earnings right away, but when you leave, you're going to get that benefit. And is that gap, right? You're sacrificing almost salary earlier. Are you going to make up for that gap?
Gotcha. So one more question. You have used year fixed effects in some of your regression models, right? And then graduation year fixed effects in others. Why not include both of them in the same regression model?
Sure. So I tried, first of all, I tried to do this, and year and grad year are highly correlated with each other. And so when using both of them, then it just washes out all the results, and we don't see any nuance in any of the results.
Yeah, and speaking of fixed effects, we also saw that you use person ID fixed effects, which is amazing, amazing robustness analysis, right? Why not use person ID fixed effects in all the regression?
Sure. So responding to Trnka et al. Wanted to look at more nuance in the results, right? What's driving this? If I use person ID fixed effects, then all those individual characteristics that don't change over time are washed out from the analysis. They're not included. And so I don't want to use person ID fixed effects for everything, because I want to actually see and understand the individual things that are changing.
Great job. Thank you.
My turn. I'm going to ask about the person ID one, because I'm just a simple experimentalist. So if you want aggregated earnings, in my mind, you would just aggregate earnings to each person. And that would be the level of analysis person. Then you control for quarters of work. And there we have it. Why make this such a huge data set when you replicate, quarter by person, and then you introduce the serial correlation of time and person, right? You have two now, two dependencies, right, within this huge database. Yeah. So just explain why do it this way as opposed to on a person level, if aggregated earnings is what you want.
Sure. So again, on the person level, I want to know more about individuals, right? So I can't just use person ID fixed effects to do that. And then that is one area for future research, right? To think about for each individual in the data set, instead of having all of their earnings, just say, what is the aggregated earnings as of the last time they're in the data set? And I could always add that as an additional robustness test to see if my findings are still valid.
Could you explain more about the analysis you did was the person ID fixed effect and what the results show, because it wasn't in the original, in the version that I read.
Oh, sure. Would it help if I went back to that slide?
Yeah, yeah.
Sure. We'll get there, I promise.
It's a lot of slides.
Yeah, I'm generally more of a less is more guy when it comes to slides, but it's a lot of content to cover. So, all right. So, just kind of in general, what are we seeing with this one? Okay, so when I use individual fixed effects, you can see I do that in all areas. I still have a positive and significant relationship, public experience relative to aggregated earnings in all cases, both aggregated and log adjusted aggregated earnings. And so, yeah, all the other variables that I look at, say, in this analysis, for example, whether someone, their gender, whether they have an advanced degree, if they have multiple degrees, if they're a veteran or not, or disabled, that doesn't change for an individual. So you don't get all of that. It's all captured with the individual fixed effects.
So why can't you just have gender, for example, in there? Because this is gonna be variation between people, not variation between the same people over time, right? That's what you want. You want variation between different people. So gender doesn't correlate, like, by controlling for person ID, you're just removing the within person variation. You're not limiting your between person variation. I'm a bit confused there. Maybe Ali can help me as a resident.
Yeah, so basically, he's looking with person ID fixed effects now only within person he's looking at within person variation, not across the person variation. So basically, so if the person ID, let's say for the RV changes from 1 year to next year, I switch from non-public to public, my gender remains the same, so it's gonna cancel out in person ID fixed effects because now I have unique ID for me. So anything that is associated with me, that does not change over the period of the time, it's gonna get dropped out from the regression model.
Oh, could you show the figure again? Again, I love the figures because all the models, it's too much for my brain.
Yeah, sorry, I thought we have a bigger screen so it'd be easier to see some of those numbers there, but yeah.
So for this one, can you identify in the data maybe, or maybe it's just a suggestion for the people like me to persuade them, if you could have some kind of figure like this by like years of experience and show when they switch, right? I think that would be the closest you could get to saying, hey, look, these people started, with the same years of experience, and these public accounting people, even though they started, lower, when they switch, their salary now, is high. Like something like this would be super cool to see in a graph. Right, for people who don't understand 3 levels of fixed effects.
Yeah, no, that's a good idea. And we did, when I was building this analysis, I did look at different levels. And so ultimately I decided to try and keep it as simple as possible. But yeah, I'm absolutely open to more visuals that show more nuance.
And sorry, one more question. How did you deal with changes of the job within a quarter?
Yeah, so in that case, we would have 2 records for 1 quarter. And so the first record, because they'd have 2, they would like say they were 1 month in public experience and public accounting and 2 months without. And so for that 1 month in public accounting, they'd have a lower quarterly earnings, and then the other 2 months would be higher than the 1. But then it just ended up being 2 records for that 1 quarter. Because you're doing the aggregated total of it.
Can we go to your research question? Just big research.
Sure. The like main research question?
Yep. I'm gonna ask a question that will echo what Dimitri was just saying, but paraphrase it in a different way. So if you look at just your research question, right? How does public accounting experience impact aggregate earnings for accounting graduates relative to non-public accounting experience? If you were to explain this and then give an example to anyone outside of accounting, outside of academia, what I conjure up in my head, if I were to explain a research question to outside people, I would say this paper, without looking at your analysis, I would say, think of someone who, did accounting public accounting for 10 years. That's one person. And then think of another person who did non-public accounting for 10 years. Right? They're very similar in every other way, except that one has public accounting experience, the other has no public accounting experience. I sum up all the aggregate earnings for the first person, I sum up the aggregate earnings for the second person, compare the aggregate earning difference.
Sure.
Right? Is that what this question is trying to get at? Is that example representative of that question?
Yes.
If that is what Dimitri was asking.
Sure.
Is why are you not doing a cross-sectional, which is just aggregated and analyze it on the basis of person, without panel data, without longitudinal. At the 10-year mark, all of the people in your sample are all 10-year veterans in accounting. Half of them public, half of them non-public. And then we aggregate all the earnings and then do a test of differences in the mean.
Sure.
That's what he's saying.
Yeah.
So he's asking, why, how come we don't do a cross-sectional like that? How come we do a panel like this? So that's my first comment is, I see a disconnect between your research question and then your analysis.
Sure.
Okay, so that's the one. Two, if we go back to your first research question, which is your RQ1. You would help me if you can explain to me how you, in plain English, how you would interpret the beta on the coefficient on your public experience. So if you have your model here.
Sure.
Somewhere on one of the slides, I remember you having that
Yep,
model. Right?
that'll be the.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. It's one of the slides I remember you having. You have it on. Can you explain to us in plain English how you interpret beta 1?
Beta 1.
Mm-hmm.
And so that would be for an individual, that's for the I at time t. So their first quarter, second quarter, 10th quarter, 40th quarter, 10 years, whatever you want to use. That coefficient will be positive and significant if that person has higher aggregated earnings than a different person at the same time without public accounting experience.
Think about how the two variables, your independent variable and your dependent variable, how they're constructed. I would phrase it like this. So beta 1 would capture the marginal difference in one additional unit of public experience. 1 quarter is 1 unit. Right? Your one additional unit of public accounting experience, how much more your aggregate earnings would be.
Yeah, that's much better phrasing.
No. What I'm saying is your beta 1 is really capturing your marginal difference, which is 1 additional quarter of public experience. How much change in your 1 unit of X will lead to how much change in your Y. Right? So that's what beta is capturing. But then think about how you constructed public experience. It's variable from 0 all the way to 9, 10 quarters, whatever quarters.
70 or something.
Exactly, right? So you are not really capturing public versus non-public. Public would be 1 public experience, 1 quarter, all the way to 40 quarters of public experience.
Sure.
But then you're not comparing all of that, which is public experience, versus 0. So go thinking back to your research question. Your research question in RQ1, which is you stated there, you're comparing people supposedly with public experience versus people who have no experience at all.
Sure.
That tells me if I were to redo the research design, I would change your IV into a dummy, whether someone either had public experience ever versus 0. That difference is capturing the additional public experience ever or not relative to your non-public experience.
So more similar to like robustness tests where I use public accounting ever as a variable.
Yeah, kind of similar to the variable you used there, yes.
Sure.
But I think that design will be more closely mirroring what your research question states.
Sure.
So that is a construct validity mismatch.
Sure. Thank you.
Again, I'm going back to another thing that we were talking about. So I made a comment about cross-sectional instead of aggregated, like running like cumulative total. The other comment I will make is it's very likely that you'll run into this in the review process where they will ask you to do it on a quarterly basis. And that is what Avi was saying. So how come you don't do it on a quarterly level basis? Because what you're getting at then is the beta will be capturing 1 unit or 1 either public experience ever, where like your public experience variable as is, 1 additional quarter of accounting experience, how much additional quarterly earnings you are getting at. That also is meaningful instead of at the aggregate, which is a running total.
Sure.
Again, the running total, cumulative on cumulative, always run into the problem with time trends, which is over time you are going to earn more, right? So that has been a consistent theme that comes up in all of our reviews before.
Sure.
So there's that comment, and all of this, propagates through the rest of the paper as well whenever you're dealing with this. And finally, when you're working on, I think it's research question 4, when you're talking about urban and non-urban, just as you were presenting, I had an idea where you can probably develop into a future paper. Is in addition to just looking at aggregate earnings, you can also incorporate cost of living, because urban cities will always have higher cost of living. So nominally, yes, you are getting more earnings, but at the same time, they pay you more because it costs more to live there.
Sure.
So for some accountants, they might not see just even if it's inflation adjusted, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not cost of living adjusted. So at the time, people's preferences might actually think about cost of living and take home pay, for example, right? And all the other considerations. So that can be an addition to another paper, in addition to your gender paper.
That's a good idea.
That increases your pipeline.
Yeah, it took a long time to build this data set and take it from the raw data to get here. So as much as I can leverage it to answer questions that are relevant to academia and profession, the more I want to do that.
So I think you have a very good start to a very rich set of papers that come along.
Do you have anything on your mind for cost of living proxy? Proxy for cost of living.
Cost of living proxy. I don't have anything, but we can Google it.
I do mention, but another thing you should probably try using is the SSI wage index, because that would be the index, I think, the closest.
Sure.
Your wages should grow consistent with that index, not the CPI. The
Yeah.
SSI wage index is the one used to index the caps for Social Security, so that grows much faster than the CPI.
Good one.
Sure, that's a good idea.
So that might be another.
Overall, great job.
Yeah.
We have seen the paper evolve so much, and it's only moving to be a better paper. So
Thank you. Appreciate your feedback
part of
and
it.
ideas throughout.
And now questions from audience.
I'm good.
I just have a comment. I think this research, although, so when I look at it as a non-accounting person, I could apply it similarly, like if I were to just look at bank companies, for instance, and I can look at that as in comparison to your public accounting, and idea is the same, right? So if you start with one of those large companies, there will be the similar trending and people favor. So it's the same. I think the generalizability of the paper is beyond just accounting, is what I think.
Question. Doing a manage by exception, knowing that this is a lot of information, what would you have done different, if anything?
You mean in the entire paper from the beginning? Probably put a little bit more time in like model design and understanding exactly how to structure things, and then it would make the rest, everything else, that much more efficient. So making the change up front in the model is a lot easier than making the change at the end in the model.